Hello again. This is the second lecture on Locke so far. It's the second lecture for week 5 as well. Now we're moving into book 2 of Locke's essay concerning human understanding. Book 2 is the heart of the whole book, the whole work. There are 4 books altogether, right? In book 1, Locke was trying to convince us that there are no innate ideas. So, in other words, he was establishing empiricism, right? To the best of his ability. He's not a rationalist, he's an empiricist. No innate ideas means all ideas come from experience. That's empiricism. All knowledge comes from experience. That's empiricism. Okay, so that set us up for book 2, which is the theory of ideas, which does tell us where they come from and how they come about. How do these ideas originate? How do you actually get them from the senses? How do you reflect on them? How do you get more knowledge by reflecting, right? All of that in book 2, and then books 3 and 4 cover applications and implications of the theory of ideas, right? The last 2 chapters cover language and law and ethics and stuff like that, but it's really just the theory of ideas applied to those areas. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's get into book 2. You don't often see the word conscious, actually, from this time period, from what I've seen, but here it is on page 302. Locke says, since we are conscious, we can have no doubt that people have in their minds several ideas. So we're starting from the point that, hey, there are lots of ideas in your mind. I mean, that's basically what he's saying as his starting point. Where do these come from? And then on pages 302 and 303, he gives you the 2 broad sources of ideas. What are their origins? Well, here are the 2 big sources, broad sources. Let me again mute something. I should do that before I start talking, but hey, what are you going to do? Okay, so these 2 broad sources are, number 1, sensation. Okay, and sensation conveys to us perceptions of things based on how we are affected, based on how our bodies are affected by things outside of us. Sensation, and then reflection. Reflection he often calls perception, so it's a certain kind of perception. That's a little confusing. Maybe he should have tweaked the terminology a bit. But he says reflection is perception of the operations of our own mind, right? And what are the operations of our own mind? Well, there's perception, again, where it's perception of external things. There's thinking, there's doubting, believing, willing, reasoning, knowing, affirming. I threw that one in because this is pretty much the same list Descartes gave us, right? If you're going to negate or doubt, you could also affirm. Okay. So those are the two broad sources, and as you can imagine, he makes it pretty clear that there's nothing, there would be nothing to reflect on if we didn't perceive anything, right? So it's sensation that sets everything into motion, right? If you perceive, then first of all, you can perceive that you perceive, right? You have ideas, you have empirical ideas that you can think about. Also with respect to being in the world, with respect to acting, when you get these ideas from the outside, they come with pleasure or pain, so then there are things to pursue and things to avoid. And so not only is your mind set in motion, but you're given motivation to go after things or avoid things. So your body is set into motion indirectly, I suppose, since we're rational beings and we make decisions and judgments and things like that. In any case, yeah, we're set into motion by what we're receiving from the outside. All right, and on page 303, this is chapter 1, if we're wondering, chapter 1 of book 2. Locke does a thought experiment. It's brief, but it's still, I would call it a thought experiment. If a child was raised in a black and white environment, that child wouldn't have any idea what green is, right? So that's not exactly an argument. It's a reaffirmation of empiricism. But if you do the thought experiment, you probably want to agree. Yeah, how would you, if you've only had experience of black and white, how would you have any idea what green is? So it's as far as it goes, it's a somewhat convincing thought experiment. Okay, still in chapter 1, looking at page 305. This goes on for a couple of pages, or even 3 pages. There is an issue about dreaming, what to do with dreaming and what to do with being asleep. This is inherited from Descartes. So I mentioned when we were talking about Descartes that Descartes had to insist that there is no dreamless sleep. Because remember, our essence is thinking. So if we quit thinking, we wouldn't exist. Ergo, therefore, we must think all through the night. That just is how it must be. We can't pop in and out of existence all the time. Right, and so Locke, he doesn't try to solve Descartes' problem for him, right? This is really Descartes' problem. Locke isn't going to say that our essence is thinking or that our essence isn't thinking. He has established this sort of metaphysical neutrality. What he does say is, look, it's ridiculous to think that I'm two different people, right? He mentions Socrates as an example. So suppose Socrates has all these dreams and he can't remember them when he's awake, right? You can imagine the dreams being connected to each other, right? So then there's this whole continuous psychological life going on while Socrates is asleep, and then there's this different continuous psychological life going on when Socrates is awake. Well, that's two different minds. That's two different people, right? So Locke's theory of personal identity is starting to show here. It comes up again later. Right now, let's just say Locke is certainly influenced by Descartes because he makes the criteria for maintaining the same personal identity internal, right? There's a sort of concession to Descartes because Descartes is saying we're thinking things, and then if you ask Locke, what is it to be the same person over time? He brings up psychological continuity. What memories do you have access to? And how do they cohere together? We're saying sleeping Socrates and waking Socrates are two different Socrates because they have two different sets of experience, and each one coheres and each has its own psychological continuity, right? So the criteria for personal identity are entirely inside the mind, right? So despite being an empiricist, Locke is very interested in the life of the mind, the inner life, right? And that still seems to be where your identity is, even though he's not explicitly agreeing with Descartes that we are essentially thinking things, and in fact, he's making trouble for that view with what he's saying. He doesn't offer a replacement view. But we are interior beings for Locke, it seems. Sensation is characterized in an interesting way on page 307, so I will quote from Locke here. He says, sensation is such an impression or motion made in some part of the body as makes it be taken notice of in the understanding. Right? And he'll harp on this later and make sure that the reader has understood. If you don't take notice of it internally, it's not perception. Which, by the way, is a very current idea, right? I mean, this is something people have been arguing about recently. How do you think about perception? Do you emphasize the right causal relationship? Am I perceiving the computer monitor because it's causing me to have a visual impression of it? That would put the main criterion external to me, right? Because the causal relation is between me and the computer monitor. It's not inside my mind. But Locke, again, is siding with those who think of us as having these rich interior lives, and that's really where our identity is, right? And he's saying, well, you're perceiving when you take notice of the impression that's caused from the outside. He doesn't say anything about construing it in a representational way, which I would certainly add, but presumably, that's part of taking notice of it. You're taking notice of it as an impression of something external. He doesn't say that. It's implied, probably. I'm not a Locke scholar, but it seems to be. Okay, so that's chapter 1. We're already done with chapter 1. There's actually a lot of short chapters in here. Okay. So, what is a simple idea exactly? Well, you know internally. This is in line with other things Locke has been saying. So ideas come to you as complex, but if you think about it, you can distinguish the ideas from each other. They're distinct. They're there to be distinguished. Imagine petting a kitten, right? You don't have any trouble distinguishing the warmth of the kitten from the softness of the kitten, right? We all assume that other people are doing this because we use these words as if it's obvious what they mean. But of course, my access to softness and warmth, that's internal to me. So really, for me to have a conversation, I have to assume that these ideas are distinct to you as well. So perceptions come in bundles, but, in a sense, they're made to be analyzed because there are different distinct ideas in the bundle coming from different sensory modalities, and we just have an intuitive awareness of that if we stop and think about it at all. On page 308, Locke makes this interesting analogy between simple ideas and atoms, right? So atomic theory is getting popular again. It was popular among the ancient Greeks, and now here in the early modern period, it's having a comeback. And Locke compares simple ideas to atoms, saying, well, we can't create or destroy them. We can only combine and divide them. You can't just create new simple ideas, just like the kid in the black and white environment can't create the idea of green out of nothing. You can combine and divide, right? So you can build elaborate structures, take apart what you see or smell or taste, whatever, get atoms, recombine into new entities. Sound familiar? That sounds like Descartes when he makes an analogy to painting, right? Okay, chapter 3 tells us the 4 different ways that ideas can originate in our minds, right? So we had 2 broad sources earlier. Now we're getting 4 sources. So we're getting a little more narrow in our categorization, right? Honing in on some things. Anyway, number 1, ideas could come from one sense only, like especially a taste or a smell. Very, very distinctive, sort of separate. They feel like they're separate from the other senses in a way. I'll leave you to think about that. Maybe you disagree. Number 2, they could be conveyed, by more than one sense. Roundness, for instance, I might have mentioned already. You could feel roundness, and you can see roundness. Eventually, Locke notes that if you could only feel, and then you suddenly had your sight restored, you hadn't had sight your whole life, you'd been blind, you wouldn't be able to see roundness right away. You'd have to get used to it. You wouldn't make a connection between the tactile sensation of roundness and the idea of roundness you get from your sight. That's a learned connection. However that may be, learned or not, some ideas come from more than one sense. Some ideas come only from reflection. The idea of perception of external things being one of those ideas. I can't see someone else's perception or someone else's activity of perceiving or someone else's perceptual experience. So the idea of perception comes from my reflecting on my perception. And then some ideas are suggested by all the ways of sensation and reflection, right? So existence, for instance, my perceptions suggest the idea of existence. My objects of perception, the books that I can see behind me, they suggest the idea of existence is so abstract and broad, it covers a lot of ground. So everything is accompanied by the idea of existence, unless I produce it in my own imagination, and even then it exists as something imagined, right? I have some kind of inner experience of that, but it doesn't have an outer existence, or so I think, so I believe. Okay, so we've got these 4 origins, right? And he's going to tell us more about them, although solidity is actually the next thing discussed, and it's discussed somewhat at length. It is an example of something that comes only from one sense, according to Locke. And it's a key notion for him in a way that I'll explain. So solidity comes only from touch, right? It's resistance. You touch something and realize by touching it that you can't go right through it, right? So that's resistance at work for you. So he seems to be suggesting that this is the essential idea of body. He doesn't use that. He's not throwing around the word essence the way Descartes was, but this seems to be a replacement notion, right? Descartes was insistent that extension was the essence of body. Locke is pretty clear that when we think of body, we think of solidity. So then solidity is the most essential attribute of body. Why is that? Well, Locke is distinguishing between empty space and actual bodies in a way that Descartes didn't. Descartes seems to have taken the side that there is no such thing as a vacuum. You've probably heard the phrase, but you maybe didn't know the historical context. Nature abhors a vacuum. There were scientists in the early modern period who actually believed a vacuum was not possible. There's just no such thing as empty space, right? Space is a continuum, and it's a plenum, maybe even is a better word. There's always something there. There can't be nothing there. It doesn't. Some people thought it didn't make sense. Locke's view is now what we think of as common sense, right? People did work on theory of vacuum. Locke mentions a vacuum pump at some point, right? So Locke believes that empty space is possible. He doesn't mention outer space, but maybe he believes space is empty out there, outside the atmosphere of the Earth. I'm not sure what his views are on that, to be honest. But in any case, right, that's what this emphasis on solidity gets him, right, that Descartes didn't have. Descartes deliberately couldn't, by design couldn't, distinguish between empty space and body, whereas Locke is saying if you have the idea of extension without solidity, well, that's just space, right? So there's solidity, the primary idea of body. A body fills up space in such a way that it resists the intrusion of other bodies, right? Any body would do that. It seems true. The resistance may not be enough to be noticeable, but okay, Locke, you're on to something. And then just pure extension by itself without solidity. That's what space is. Okay. Moving on. Now we're in chapter 5 all of a sudden already. The multimodal ideas are also, it's a familiar list. In other words, the ideas that come from at least touch and sight, that's what Locke mentions, are extension, figure, motion and rest, right? Those are qualities that Descartes emphasized as ones that are really in the realm of mathematics, right? And so insofar as we can understand the world in that way, we can be certain of what we're perceiving of the world. Locke has a similar view, but it's not exactly the same view. These multimodal attributes must be in the bodies, right? But there is a gap between the bodies and our idea of them, the extendedness and figure of them and our idea of them. Locke is overly confident that our ideas resemble those qualities out there. once there's a gap, who's to say there's a resemblance? Um, but it's this multimodal nature that they recur across sensory modalities that makes him confident, right? And when we get to Berkeley will say that doesn't work, Locke. So we'll leave it at that. It's enough to understand that this list is interesting. Descartes already did something with it. Locke is doing something similar with it. Going into chapter 6, Locke says that reflection reveals two principal actions of the mind. There's perception or thinking. He lists those sort of interchangeably. So again, he's ambiguating on perception. Kind of wish he wouldn't do that. But anyway, that's what he says. Thinking. Let's say thinking then. And then the second principal action of the mind is volition or willing. The two faculties, the two main faculties that do the thinking and the willing are the understanding and the will. Gosh, again, this is familiar. This is Descartes. Meditation 4. Not that it was original to Descartes. That special list was somewhat peculiar to Descartes. This is somewhat standard stuff. But in any case, those are the two things that the mind is constantly doing. It's thinking, it's representing the world to itself, right? You do that all day. And then willing, anytime you want something or decide to do something or act on an impulse, there's some amount of willing going on. So yeah, those do seem to be the two principal actions. Right, in a way, I have an ongoing intention to give a lecture right now. This is not what Locke says. I'm just elaborating here. If I didn't have an ongoing intention, I'd probably go find a candy bar? No, I don't really obsess about candy bars that much. Seemed like a good example. No, there's actually water in front of me. So I was going to say, well, I'd stop whenever I wanted for a drink of water. Instead, I'm trying to get out as many words as I can because of this ongoing intention. But yeah, if I didn't have the ongoing intention, it's not just that I'd drink as much water as I want. I'd wander off and do something else I want to do. I'd be more whimsical and spontaneous, except that there's this ongoing volition, ongoing intention to do this project, and I'll keep going till I'm done. I'm just trying to agree with, my point is, I'm trying to agree with Locke. We actually are doing those two things pretty much all the time. Okay. And then, so there's the things conveyed through one sense, things conveyed through more than one sense. We just mentioned the two main things conveyed through reflection. And then there's a list on page 311 of things conveyed through all the ways of sensation and reflection. Pleasure and pain, not surprisingly. It's not just that external objects are, or certainly tend to be pleasurable or painful, but so do our thoughts. I'll leave you to reflect on it. I think that's right. I mean, generally we're in a mood of some sort. So there's an overall emotional tenor. And then with specific thoughts, there's some amount of pleasure or pain annexed to them. That's often why I'm having the thoughts. I'm thinking of something exciting, I'm thinking of something frustrating, etc. Right? My practical life is often guiding what's going on in my understanding. Okay, so pleasure and pain are conveyed through all the sources. So is power, right? These external bodies have powers that produce sensory impressions in me. That's somewhat evident. I don't have to think about it too much to realize that I have the power of thought within myself. I can think about what I want. I'll think of an elephant now a hippopotamus. There's some kind of power there enabling me to have thoughts, have different thoughts, have the thought I want to have at any given time. I already mentioned existence is conveyed through reflection and perception and unity. Right? I mentioned that there are bundles of impressions. That's how objects show up for us. Objects have different sensory properties, and they show up as perceptual unities. And then if your thoughts aren't disordered, then over time, your thoughts convey a unity, express a unity, right? There's a coherence there. There ought to be. So there's a unity there as well. Okay. And then finally, there is a question about whether we can think anything beyond these sources. Here are Locke's words from page 312. This is section 10. He's gone over these different sources, and he says, "These, if they are not all, are at least, as I think, the most considerable of those simple ideas which the mind has, and out of which are made all its other knowledge, all of which it receives only by the two aforementioned ways of sensation and reflection. Nor let anyone think these are too narrow bounds for the capacious mind of man to expatiate in, which takes its flight farther than the stars, and cannot be confined by the limits of the world, that extends its thoughts often even beyond the utmost expansion of matter, and makes excursions into that incomprehensible inane." I mean, on the one hand, he's being an empiricist and saying that, anything you think about originates in the senses, but you also get this wonderful sense of transcendence here. I actually think that's the main thing missing from the empiricist picture. He's expressing transcendence, but how do you account for it? Why do you think of these interior ideas as representing things outside of you? Why do you do that? So that's a kind of transcendence, right? The idea transcends itself toward something outer. You construe it as representing something outer. Why? Maybe that's innate. Locke didn't really bring that up, or didn't think it through, didn't raise the question of why we do that and where this sense of transcendence really comes from. So beautiful words, beautiful notion of transcendence. I wonder if he's thought through all the implications of it. Obviously, I'm having a doubt right now. Okay, so now going into chapter 8, we want to distinguish qualities from ideas. I like this point about the shadow. So the shadow seems like a thing, like there it is. There's that shadow. Like you can. I wasn't doing a good job getting my finger in the screen, but there's that there's that shadow. Um, yeah, I mean, a shadow is made of darkness, as you know, but it appears to us as a thing. Um, and then that idea sort of opens up an interesting discussion. There's some kind of leeway between those powers that produce the ideas and the ideas, and it's hard to infer what powers there are based on the ideas that we're getting. A shadow being a case in point, definitely an idea, but is it directly produced by a power? I mean, how do you? I'm not going to take a stand on that. How do you want to parse that? Right? The sun has to be shining, or there has to be some light source for there to be a shadow, but the shadow is where the light isn't reaching. So, how do you work that out metaphysically? It's an interesting way to start chapter 8 for sure, to mention the shadow. So to mention an idea we can get a better handle on. There's the snowball, right? So we want to distinguish qualities and ideas. So a snowball is a thing out there. That's how we're talking about it right now. It has the power to produce in me the idea of whiteness. And so that's a quality that it has. And then the whiteness is an idea within me. So there's this complementary pairing of qualities and ideas, but we want to understand that they're separate. There are bodies out there that have powers to produce ideas in me, and those ideas, when produced, really are in me. They're interior, right? And so that's part of Locke's basic metaphysical picture, right? And don't get them confused. Even though he was really confident about how certain ideas resemble certain things out there, in general, he's skeptical, and he's very keen on this point that you mustn't project resemblance more than you should. Okay, so along those lines, on page 313, if you're wondering where I am now, this is still chapter 8. Bodies have these primary qualities, and they always retain them no matter how finely we divide them. What qualities are these? Solidity, extension, motion or rest, number and figure. Again, these are Descartes' mathematical qualities, so there's a certain kind of agreement going on here. He is allowing that these primary qualities are out there. We have ideas inside that resemble what's going on out there. As far as he can conceive, these attributes are retained no matter how big or small the bodies get. That's questioned by contemporary science, right? Atoms are mostly empty space, we think. So if you get down to a certain micro level, what seemed solid isn't solid, actually. So Locke is depending on conceptual analysis to drive his metaphysics, though he doesn't think that's what he's doing. But we'll leave it at that. Another interesting point where Locke's a bit off, but you can see why he said what he said. On page 314, he says, bodies only operate on each other through impulse. Bodies have to touch to transmit impulses to each other. It's interesting. There's an interesting story here that we can't get into all the details of. Locke's essay was published in 1689. Newton developed the theory of gravity in 1687, 2 years before Locke published the book. But Locke had been working on the book for 20 years before he published it. So something went awry in here. Locke is saying bodies only move each other through touch around the same time that Newton is putting out the theory of gravity, which allows for action at a distance. Although Newton himself was a little worried about the metaphysics of gravity, and we can't really get into that either. So maybe Newton would have agreed with Locke, but we don't. We do see gravity as a case of action at a distance. That's what we think is going on, right? We'll leave it at that. It's not a physics class, obviously. Okay, and then still on page 314, we get a bit into the metaphysics of perception. We were talking about it as an inner experience, but Locke does make it clear, well, if there's a body out there and I'm having an interior perception of it, and bodies can only set each other into motion through touch, then it does have to be the case that imperceptible bodies are transmitting some kind of motion to me after being affected by those external bodies that I'm perceiving. That might have sounded really complicated, but what it means is, as we know, photons are bouncing all around the room. They're bouncing off objects and then hitting my retinas, right? And that's why I see things. Also, sound waves are being transmitted through the air and then making my inner ears move. We know this. This is common sense now. But it was actually still a big deal when Locke was writing about it. Not that it was a completely new theory. Again, the ancient Greeks had these ideas, but Locke was getting close to the point of being able to prove these things based on his knowledge of the science of the time. Interesting times Locke was living in, for sure. Okay. Skipping a bit. We don't need everything here. So skipping chapter 9, going to chapter 10. Looking at page 320, Locke starts to focus on faculties of the mind, right? So remember, intellect and will, those are faculties. Those have the powers of producing thoughts and producing volitions. And I have these other faculties, these other powers within me. And he says some really interesting things about some of them. There's retention. Locke rightly notes that, if it weren't for retention, the other faculties we have wouldn't do us much good. So he comes close to formulating the idea of working memory, right? Memory isn't just about recalling things that you want to recall right now. It's about holding things in your mind that were there 5 or 10 seconds ago. He mentions the narrowness of the human mind, which I find to be it strikes me as a contemporary point. Obviously, he was saying it 300 years ago or so. But this is something philosophers think a lot about now, finitude. So the human mind is so narrow. It holds so little. Consciousness is so thin that we can't hold on to very much at one time. We've got to be able to recall things when we need to recall them, right? And then hold on to them long enough to use them in a calculation or a bit of reasoning or whatever it is. Memory's crucial. You don't have material to work with. If you want to make an argument or make an equation, you've got no material to work with if your memory isn't functioning. And that's why he says if memory's lacking, if memory is wanting, your other faculties won't do you any good. That's a really good insight. Locke's a good phenomenologist. I don't know how many of you have studied phenomenology, but I'm coming back to Locke after a long time for this class. I'm appreciating how much Locke must have affected Edmund Husserl, who we consider the founder of phenomenology, someone I've studied a lot. I'm being struck by connections that I didn't see the last time I went through Locke, less carefully perhaps, the last time. And then abstraction is a big deal. It's too bad I've already been going on for 46 minutes. Just briefly, we have to have general ideas. Locke rightly, good phenomenology, Locke points out that without abstraction, every idea is a particular idea. Right? It's as if ideas, are situated. They are. It's not just as if, but okay, ideas are situated in a certain time, in a certain place. So in a way, there's an anticipation of Hume, right, who said, well, everything's changing all the time, right? So stable objects are a fiction. That's not Locke's view. I'm just saying there's an anticipation here. He's saying if it weren't for abstraction, everything would be different from everything else in my interior theater, right? It would just be a bunch of particulars. However, I can look at different white things. I got a notebook. I got a textbook. I got a bookmark. I can look at the different white things and abstract a notion of whiteness. Is it hazy then? Is it vague? Berkeley's going to complain about this. Not only Berkeley, but it's a start. In any case, though, Locke is on to something, right? That word whiteness, we think it has a definite meaning, so then there must be something in common among the white things that we abstract from them, right? So there must be this general idea of whiteness that holds the different experiences together in a single bundle of meaning. Okay, and he also says, rightly says, you wouldn't get very far in your thought without abstraction. You have to have general terms to do your most important thinking, right? To come up with general principles, to come up with general rules of action, to come up with the theory of gravity, you have to be able to think in general terms. You have to be able to abstract from the particulars, right? So, last point for today, abstraction, very big deal, very important. All right, it's a bit long, sorry. I mean, the consoling point here, I guess, is, well, if it were an in-person class, you'd have to show up somewhere and listen to me for an hour and 15 minutes at a stretch. But the last video was like 42 minutes or something, and this one is almost 50. And that's it for week 5. So you don't have to be anywhere in particular to watch the video, and they're still shorter than actual lectures in real life. So, hey, that's something. I know I should edit them, but how am I going to have time to edit them? Does anybody want to be my intern and edit the videos? Give me a call or send me an email, whatever. Okay, thanks. It's been fun.